Tafseer. I'm excited because yesterday we kind of just had an unexpected thing. But inshallah, today we're in place and we're going to actually discuss a couple nice things, a couple stories, and inshallah, get to know a couple Sahaba as well. Because, of course, the Sahabi was actually known one, that he had participated in Badr, two, that ironically, he actually thought that he would have the permission, since he had a history of, let's call it, being good, that he would be given the permission to drink. And sure thing. But then something happened, and certainly, let's inshallah just know more about the story and learn more about it inshallah later on. So stay tuned to learn more about which Sahabi is that and what exactly was the story. So let's actually start. And remember, we're doing our tafsir and we're still in this ayah. Okay, so we left off at this آية ليس على الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات جناح فيما طعموا إذا ما اتقوا وآمنوا وعملوا الصالحات ثم اتقوا وآمنوا ثم اتقوا وأحسنوا. And then we went in details in regards to, is this taqwa different from this taqwa? Is this one also different? What are the contexts? We mentioned some of that, so we're not going to go in details with it. And there was a question that Sister Umayyah was asking, which is this quote right there, وَأَمَّا النَّيْءُ مِنْهُ فَحَرَامٌ. As for what is, or what was from, of course, uncooked from that, then it would be haram. And that would basically be the raw ones. And what raw of what? Now, in the context itself, it might actually seem that we're talking about raw grapes or raw raisins, or probably raw dates. And certainly that might actually seem confusing right there, but that's not what it was actually referring to. So I did go to the Madhab Hanafi books, because you want to remember that this is considered a secondary source for Madhab Hanafi. For Madhab, this is a primary source for Madhab Maliki, but not for Madhab Hanafi. So if right there he wants to say that ذهب Abu Hanifa, then it's not enough for me to quote and say, well, this is what the Hanafi madhab says. So I needed to go to the actual madhab Hanafi and actually see what the madhab Hanafi was saying. And sure thing, al-madhab al-Hanafi was regarding sulafat al-inab. What is sulafat al-inab? So sulafat al-inab is actually two things. Number one, when you grit the grapes and you would squeeze the grapes, right? So of course you've got the grapes, and while you're squeezing them, of course you've got the juice and the grape still there. You're probably going to take out the seeds, and I guess all the grapes that were already right now all I guess squeezed and right there. So in that situation, of course, you're left with this mixture. Now, here's the thing. Let's say you bottle this mixture. You bottle of course, the grapes, and you bottle, let's say just the juice itself. So if you bottle the juice itself, that, of course, if it's in the early stage, of course, you wouldn't really get it fermented unless it stayed some while. Okay, so it would take some while to ferment. So if you were to, let's say, open that bottle, you wouldn't hear the sound that it was getting gases. You wouldn't hear the sound, if I can do it. All right. All right. If you were to get these kind of sounds, that actually means that it is called sulafat al-inab. Now it's starting to get a certain soda. Now it's starting to ferment. That's whether it was from raw grapes or whether it was cooked, okay, then in that situation for al-madhhab al-Hanafi, they would regard that as basically right now haram. Okay. And that's the thing that I guess this area that for us that we needed to clarify it. The second part is that if it already fermented, okay, if it already fermented to a certain level, how do I know that it really got into the level of perhaps becoming already an alcoholic beverage? Well, you would see a foam on top of it. If there's a foam on top of it starting to, I guess, build up, that means it was starting to go into a fermentation to the level of having an amount of alcohol. So in that situation, that would be basically haram. So we were wanting to delay this one because I didn't know the answer to this one, had to do my little homework. So that was one piece of it. And then we said we were going to continue. Of course, ثم اتقوا وأحسنوا. So ثم اتقوا وأحسنوا والله يحب المحسنين. All right. So when we talked about this taqwa, we said that there is a repetition, but this repetition within this context would basically mean a different thing. So this level of taqwa would be that the person certainly is being consistent with their Islam. So now they're embracing the ruling. They're actually embracing, of course, the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're embracing Islam, and certainly, the second one is that they're actually being consistent in implementing the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here we go. And think of it as the stage. Remember that hadith, Hadith Jibril alayhi salam, when Jibril alayhi salam comes in a human form and then asks the Prophet sallam certain questions, and he says, "Akhbirni an al-Islam, tell me about Islam." And then he would tell him that al-Islam an tashhada an la ilaha illallah wa anna Muhammad Rasulullah wa tuqima as-salah wa tasuma wa tu'ti az-zakah wa tsuma Ramadan wa tahujja al-bayt. So that's basically the level of Islam. In other words, is it possible that the person that might actually be believing in Islam, but not necessarily implement all of these? In other words, go into a certain level of, I guess, faith. They're not practicing really, but they're just embracing the faith right there. And how do we understand the second question that the Prophet ﷺ was asked when, of course, Jibril alayhi salam asks him, وَأَخْبِرْنِي عَنِ الْإِيمَانِ, tell me about al-Iman. And he says, al-Iman أن تؤمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم الآخر وبالقدر خيره وشره. It's to believe in Allah, and the angels, and also the prophets and the holy books, and the good and the evil or the bad destiny. So what does that differ from the first one? So the first one contained a certain level of action, a certain level where, yes, the person is embracing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In that practice, the person is basically applying salah, putting in siyam, putting in zakah, and if they have the amount of money to do zakah, well, they would, and if they have the ability to do hajj, then they would. But in the second one, it didn't really contain, at least within the answer, that Jibril alayhi salam, when he asked the Prophet sallam, the Prophet sallam's response didn't actually contain anything in application. So it's an tu'mina billah wa malaikatihi, it's to believe in Allah, the angels, the books, etc. So in other words, it was more focused on another type of an action, which is the action that the heart is doing. So what does that mean? How do I get from stage A to stage B, and what am I supposed to be doing? So that's that point right there where you would see the other ayat, the other hadith would explain to us what is necessary to do, whether it's to, let's say the Prophet ﷺ said, لَيْسَ الْمُؤْمِنُ بِالطَّعَانِ وَلَا اللَّعَانِ وَلَا الْفَاحِشِ وَلَا الْبَذِيءِ, that a believer is not A person that is constantly cursing is not a person that is engaging in illicit behavior, not a person that is engaging in, let's say, words that are, well, it's illicit words, but more, there's a big difference between al-fuhsh and also al-badha'a. Al-fuhsh would be speaking of things that are supposed to be private, well, private, and then the person is speaking and I guess giving such, let's call it a detailed description. That's fuhsh. Al-badha'a would be speaking usually of matters relating to sexual behavior, relating to private parts and all of that, and starts talking about it as if it's an entertainment thing. That's al-badha'a. Okay, so al-badha'a would be this kind of illicit speech. Al-fuhsh would be that the person is engaging in more of low speech, but not necessarily sexual. Okay, so this is just one example of what it means to live that level of iman. But we do have the rest of the ayat. When it says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, or laysa ala alladhina amanu, it's always saying, well, this is what a true mu'min would do, and therefore, this is what they would take in consideration in serious practice, and that's what they would apply in life. So when we're seeing those ayat giving us those stages, so that's why this ayah, within this context, the first one would be within the level of Islam. That they basically had the religious integrity, the religious faith, to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and embrace Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the first level. The second level is basically when a person has the religious integrity, has that faith, believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and has that commitment. Okay. Now, the third one is basically, remember going back to Hadith Jibreel, when Jibreel alayhi salam tells him, well, tell me what would be, what in other words would be defining ihsan. And he said, أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه. It's to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you could see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, when you look at stage 2 and stage 3, it was more focused on a certain, let's say, implication and not necessarily application. So in the second stage, it was saying, well, that it's to believe in Allah, the angels, etc. But how do we get from, but isn't that anyways what Shahada was? That's what Shahada contained anyways. So nothing really new. Well, there is something new in the first stage, which is the stage of Islam. Certainly that was within the level of Islam already, but still the person is not embracing it entirely as what really motivates them to change. So you could know something is haram, but then still do it. But it isn't until your recognition of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your recognition malaika, your recognition of the details of all of that, not until it really goes into your heart and your heart completely absorbs that, will you really take this as a serious matter. Not until your heart really absorbs it in a serious matter are you really going to be capable of living that level of iman. Same thing when you're looking at the level of ihsan. You won't really be a person that is capable of reaching the stage, as mentioned in the hadith, أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه. It's to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you could see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, although it sounds very rhetorical, but it isn't rhetorical, because what it was really telling you is that you had completely embraced the stage in the stage of al-Iman, that it went so deep now that it wasn't anymore just a word of motivation and keeping you to a certain level of consistency, but no, this is really you. Now, this is extremely important. So what happened is that in the stage of Islam, you were trying to put in a certain level of consistency. In the level of Iman, you are consistent. You do have your shortcomings. In the level of Ihsan, you're so committed that it actually became your own identity. It defines who you are. You're not just Muslim, I don't know, wearing hijab or probably doing what Islam says or praying or being kind and donating and, doing or being good to your parents, etc. You're not just doing that because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ordering you to do it. But no, in the level of ihsan, that's what you enjoy. You just embrace it wholeheartedly because now you had just dealt in the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are really right now who you are and what you are, because you only see through the lens of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why أَن تَعْبُدَ اللَّهَ كَأَنَّكَ تَرَاهُ. It's to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you could see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What happened? The person just completely related to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that right now they don't know any other way. They just embrace it wholeheartedly that they don't know any other way. That's what they enjoy. That's who they are. That's what makes them feel that that level of I guess identity where they connect deeply with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they don't want to connect with anything else. So that's اتقوا وأحسنوا والله يحب المحسنين. When that person reaches that level, that's when they would know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves them because they too had fully loved Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I want you to look at the word yuhib right there. That love that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala يحب المحسنين, because where did this actually come as a result, and why use the word love within this context? And even though you could see the word taqwa, how is it that Wallahu yuhibbul muhsinin and didn't say, for example, that everything will fear a person that has taqwa? So why and how can we combine love and fear in one sentence? You would combine perhaps love and maybe closeness, maybe. You would combine fear with security, but not fear and love together. How is that even possible? Let me explain. So when you see that ittaqaw wa ahsanu, ittaqwa is not necessarily fear alone. Taqwa is to put on a shield of different principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because you want to remember whether you're feeling guilty or whether because you had probably committed something haram, or whether you know that something is haram and you don't do it because it's haram. That's that stage that you had recognized that to you, the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most important thing to you. So you would put on all these principles that He wanted you to embrace. And the reason why you would embrace all of that, not only out of fear, but also out of love. So your love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically made you recognize also that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not love you, that the consequences are going to be great consequences, major consequences. So what would you do? You would embrace Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's principles out of love for whatever He had ordered you, and out of fear that if you would trespass the limit, that he might not be content over you. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then tells you, Wallahu yuhibbul muhsineen. And out of that, he will take you out of all the different fears that you had feared by him basically giving you the love. So he put forward the love in order for you to remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most important thing for your taqwa, for your ihsan, for you, that stage, that moment when you had fully embraced your love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that was really defining who you are, then in that situation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will also love you, means that he will be there. When you make the dua, he'll be there. When you would basically need security or need shifa or whatever it is, he'll basically consider your own matters as a priority. So that's what it means, Wallahu yuhibbul muhsineen. Do I have to get everything that I want? Let's say you wanted shifa, you wanted cure, you wanted children, and you basically thought that you were going to get that. But when, of course, you made the dua, it didn't happen. It can happen. Well, but I wanted to make the dua. I thought, Wallahu yuhibbul muhsineen. But you want to remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not an impulsive God. He does not react and act based on what emotions you have, or what emotions, whether it's hub or whether it's kur. The Lord Almighty is not an impulsive God, but the Lord Almighty will, for the Salihin, he'll act based on your favor. So if, for example, your illness is probably a better thing for you, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will answer your dua, not necessarily by giving you what you want, but by giving you what is best for you. So that's how al-mu'min embraces al-qada wal-qadar and al-qadar fi khayrihi wa sharrihi. What is al-qadar fi khayrihi wa sharrihi? Al-qadar basically means destiny. When we speak of destiny, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because he is the Almighty God and is not controlled or is not, of course, confined within time or within space and place, then in that situation, you recognize that the Lord Almighty had already known what was going to happen in the future, or what is happening, or what happened in the past, or in the present, what is happening in the present. Then in that situation, you recognize that the Lord Almighty is not confined within time. Since he's not confined within time, you would recognize that the Lord Almighty, when he answers your dua, or when he determines something, whether good or evil, that it is actually in your favor based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, based on his names and attributes, when we're speaking about that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is most just, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ghafoor, is Rahim, is the one that gives it the cure, and the list goes on and on. So we embrace the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, embrace the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by embracing also the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right, let's continue right there. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. Well, one thing I would like to say is that there is a story, rather really strange, Qudama ibn Mad'un al-Jumahi. So Qudama ibn Mad'un al-Jumahi, just an idea about him. He actually participated in the Battle of Badr. What's the importance about the Battle of Badr? The Battle of Badr, the Prophet ﷺ had basically said, well, you never know. It could be, and of course we're talking about 315 Sahabi participated in the Battle of Badr, and the Prophet ﷺ had said, you never know. It could have been that the people that participated in the Battle of Badr, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told them, do as you may do, whatever you may do, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forgiven you your past and your future sins. But he didn't tell them that that's what happened, but that's al-amal, that's the hope, that's what the Prophet ﷺ, because of the magnificence of that day, the Prophet ﷺ was basically giving them that this is a possibility for the magnificence of that day. The Sahaba that participated in the Battle of Badr were also known as al-Badriyin. The Sahaba al-Badriyin. Qudama ibn Mad'un was part of al-Badriyin. So Qudama ibn Mad'un, of course, was one of the early Muslims. In other words, he was one of the early Muslims that were originally from Mecca, and later he basically migrated to Abyssinia with his two brothers, Uthman and Abdullah, and later took the second migration, which is going to Medina. So remember, they migrated at least a group of Sahaba. We're talking about 70 or more Sahaba. They migrated to Abyssinia because they couldn't handle the persecution in Mecca. So they were given the permission to go and travel to Ethiopia/Abyssinia. They go there and stay there, but there was at one point Uthman ibn Mad'un, a very, very famous Sahabi. Uthman ibn Mad'un basically hears false rumors that the people of Mecca had become Muslim. So he goes back to Mecca, but then recognizes that that's a false rumor, goes back to Abyssinia. They stay there for some while, and then there was a major order that all the Muslims were supposed to be migrating to Medina in order to form a community there. So whether the Muslims in Abyssinia or whether the Muslims in of course, southern Yemen, or Yemen itself, or Oman, etc., they were ordered all to actually come forward and go to Medina. So let's see what happened. He basically lived long, of course, and plus, look at this one. He was also the in-law of Umar ibn al-Khattab. So what does that mean? So that means Umar ibn al-Khattab is actually married to his sister. Okay, is married to his sister, and Abdullah and Hafsa are basically who? He's basically their uncle. He's their maternal uncle, which is Qudama ibn Mad'un. He's their maternal uncle for who? Hafsa and Abdullah. So who's Hafsa? Hafsa is the Prophet ﷺ's wife. Oh no, I got you lost. Okay, let's do it again. Umar ibn al-Khattab had two sons, Abdullah and Hafsa. Abdullah and Hafsa's mother is basically Qudama ibn Mad'un and Uthman ibn Mad'un and Abdullah ibn Mad'un's sister. Okay, so there we go. Umar ibn al-Khattab assigned Qudama ibn Mad'un to be a mayor, basically on the city of al-Bahrain. Bahrain today, you know, the city, Bahrain, Yamama. Okay, that's basically what he was supposed to be doing, like a deputy, a mayor. In other words, he was in the government. But then al-Jarud, who's al-Jarud? So al-Jarud was one of the leaders of Abd Qais. Al-Jarud himself was a Sahabi, and this Sahabi was actually Christian and then later embraced Islam. But al-Jarud himself went to complain to Umar ibn al-Khattab that Qudama ibn Mad'un was engaged in alcohol drinking. Well, that's an issue right there that Umar ibn al-Khattab had to deal with. So then, well, it's not enough for al-Jarud to come forward and say, hey, this is what I this is what I had seen, or this is what I basically, whether it's the smell of alcohol or probably maybe, perhaps vomiting, and then that causes a suspicion. What about probably the breath that person might have? How do we understand all of this? Well, al-Jarud comes forward and basically files his concern and files basically his complaint. Why Umar ibn al-Khattab? Because Umar ibn al-Khattab was the Khalifa. And certainly, this is a government official. That's Qudama ibn Mad'un is a government official. And al-Jarud is right now assigned to be under Qudama ibn Mad'un's power. So think of it as Qudama ibn Mad'un, since he was the wali, he was basically considered like the person that is on the upper level, and al-Jarud was basically working under that. So think of Qudama ibn Mad'un really being al-Jarud's boss. And who's the main boss here? Well, Umar ibn al-Khattab is the Khalifa. But of course, even if it's the Khalifa, in Islam, what actually holds the highest level is basically the judiciary, which basically is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which basically is Islam itself. So, of course, al-Jarud, he had no option but to file that complaint, and sure thing he did. Let's see, here's the details within the story that ad-Daraqutni goes in details in regards to the story and what happened. Okay, so during the time, we're going to get into this story in just a bit. Let's see. All right, during the time, just a note, okay, before we get into the story, during the time when, of course, before the actual punishment was revealed, you would just keep in mind that punishments and the different punishments for different sins did not actually get revealed until later on. So in the early stages of Islam, for example, zina was considered haram. There are certain things, they were considered haram from the very early stages of Islam. No doubt about it. Zina was considered haram from the early stages. We're talking about the 3rd, 4th year, and same thing with stealing, same thing with interest, same thing with a lot of different things. They were considered haram. But the punishment was not assigned because there was no government at the time. There was no government, so you couldn't apply any type of a punishment because that needed an institution to verify, one, the people, verify, of course, a number of different powers. So you basically needed to make sure that there was an institution to support those that are in power to make sure that when you're applying this punishment, that it's not that the family is going to come running after you and consider that you had committed an assault against them. It's supposed to be an institution. Okay, let's see. In the beginning of Islam, Ibn Abbas had said that those that were drinking, they used to basically just get hit. Was it flogging? Was it hitting with, I don't know, shoes, or what was the hitting looking like? So he said, well, it was like with the hands, with shoes, with sticks, until the Prophet ﷺ had died. Okay, but then, of course, during the Khilafah of Bakr as-Siddiq, okay, during the last thing, when before the Prophet ﷺ, hold on, let's see. When the Prophet ﷺ had died, during the Khilafah of Bakr as-Siddiq, all right, and of course, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had basically used, instead of this method as a punishment, in other words, it wasn't some random hitting or random flogging or random punishment. It was more of an organized way. So Abu Bakr as-Siddiq basically assigned 40 flogs And Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, that's what he had applied for those that had been drinking. 40 flogs. Note, when you're looking at flogs, just a note, the stick that you're using to flog must not contain things like maybe nails on it, or perhaps anything that might puncture the body, break the bones, or perhaps cause any cuts on the body. That's not permissible. That's number one. Number two is that the person that is flogging cannot raise their arm to a higher level than their own shoulder, and it must be at a lower level. Okay, so that's the whole. So why do corporal punishment? Isn't that against human rights? You want to remember that the definition of human rights, Islam basically has its definition of human rights. Islam considers that المصلحة العامة مقدمة على المصلحة الخاصة. Let's write that down right there. I'm just going to write it down. المصلحة العامة مقدمة على المصلحة الخاصة. So the general rule in Islam is that when we're speaking about different considerations and what we take prior, the public consideration, the public security, and the public rights in applying the law is precedent over personal freedom or personal interest. So we would consider the community interest over the personal interest. That's number one. Number two, in using different forms of what defines human rights, what defines as a punishment that is basically an appropriate punishment, or is it going beyond the limit? What actually defines that? That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically sent the rulings in regards to punishments and permitted certain corporal punishments, including the highest level of, for example, the highest level capital punishment for things like zina for a person that had a marriage experience before. Okay, so that would be those rare cases, but in general, we're talking about different kinds of punishments. There's al-hudud, there's al-qisas, and there is at-ta'zir. I want you to get this one. You know, we're going to get to the story in just a bit, but I want you to look at these ones because this is extremely important. Okay, so when I'm going to take a different note right there and just keep it in mind. Okay, so we've got al-hudud, and here we go. Al-hudud, and we've got al-qisas, and we also have at-ta'zir. What's the difference? So al-hudud, they're basically assigned punishments. There's no way that we can, in any shape or form, make up our own limits or our own ways of how this punishment is applied. We would basically go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's a certain number for it. There's a certain description. There are some details of making sure, how do we make sure that the person fits that, let's say, the qualification of that particular behavior? How do we make sure that that person basically deserves the punishment? What are the different ways of making sure and verifying that this person is accountable, whether it's reached the age of puberty or whether it's probably the mental wellness, let's say it this way, and making sure that this person is not going through probably psychosis or different kinds of mental disorders, etc., making sure that we have everything in place. And certainly number 5, that this person is not going through some form of coercion, that they didn't act based on their own will. So when that's it, or probably number 6, that the person had the information. In other words, they didn't act out of ignorance. So in that situation, of course, that's the government to basically apply these punishments and no one else. Al-Qisas is different because al-Qisas, there are two things, is that it's basically human rights, and we're talking about human, let's say a person killed another person, okay? And let's say they killed them by mistake. Let's say they killed them deliberately. It was first degree murder. Then in that situation, al-Qisas would also allow the family to decide whether they want, let's say, the retaliation, a life for a life, or whether they would prefer to get the blood money, which is equivalent to almost $200,000 or more. We were looking at the with that, of course, the currency. So almost within that range, okay? And or what do we do? Is the family going to be paying the blood money, or is it the person himself? And the list goes on and on. Okay, that's al-Qisas. Ta'zir, on the other hand, it could be just different let's call them misbehaviors, let's call it illicit things that are not reaching the level of perhaps major sins like zina, stealing, etc., those major sins, but we're talking about less sins like that, maybe engaging in, maybe threatening people, maybe looking at illicit things, maybe saying illicit words, etc. Then in that situation, the qadi or the judge assigned by the government would have the right to assign what would be a fair punishment. Should we do corporal punishment? Should we do and probably make them pay a fine? Or should they do community service? Should we probably get them into maybe jail time, correction, correction facilities and prison time, whatever it is, and how long is that going to be for? All these different things, they're basically considered ta'zir, and that's basically to be left for the qadi. It isn't a certain punishment. So you want to keep in mind that, of course, within these, let's call them parameters, of course, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq basically used the flogging, 40 floggings for alcohol drinking, and Umar ibn al-Khattab basically had also flogged for 40 flogs, in other words, continued within that assignment, until, of course, one man was brought.
So that was considered ta'zir?
Was that considered ta'zir? That was considered ta'zir, but then there are differences of opinions whether this is a had or ta'zir, because during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there's the debate, because the Prophet ﷺ basically did himself actually had right there يضربون في عهد رسول الله, so they were getting some form of a corporal punishment. It wasn't necessarily a certain number, but it was basically getting them, I guess, hit in a way. Okay, but it isn't until Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, well, let's make it into 40 flogs and take it from there. Okay, let's see. All right, now the second part is that this man, during the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab, was brought to Umar ibn al-Khattab, and he was from al-Muhajirin, and what did this guy do? Well, he basically had been drinking. So that's when Umar ibn al-Khattab, when he ordered that he would be flogged, so he said, why are you flogging me? Now that's the story that I wanted you to hear. Who's that person that was brought forward? Well, that's the guy that we were talking about before. Remember the guy that we were talking about before, Uthman ibn Mad'un? That's what happened. Let's see what the story and what really happened during Umar ibn al-Khattab. And I want you to live within these Sahaba that later, of course, they won, later right now are holding real positions, real power, and they were right now supposed to be responsible in implementing what the Prophet ﷺ had left in legacy, left behind. Let's see what happened. Let's see the story, and let's just see how this unfolds. Okay, so this man, which is Qudama ibn Mad'un, was basically brought forward. But Qudama ibn Mad'un, he basically objected, and he said, wait a minute, why are you going to flog me when we could go back to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and see that you don't have the right to do that? So Umar ibn al-Khattab said, well, أي كتاب الله أي كتاب الله أو كتاب الله تجد ألا أجلدك. Where? In other words, what ayah are you referring to that's actually telling me that I shouldn't be basically flogging you for that drinking? And he said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically said, لَيْسَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ جُنَاحٌ فِيمَا طَعِمُوا. That for those that had believed and those that had done good and righteous acts, they would not be held accountable for what they had consumed. And he said, and I have a history from being from the believers, doing righteous behaviors, and I was part of those that had lived a taqwa and became a believer and lived a taqwa. And basically, hey, guess what? I was even with the Prophet ﷺ, and I witnessed Badr. I was there during the Battle of Uhud. I was there during the Battle of al-Khandaq. I was there during all these. Then you cannot but say that I've got all the evidence to prove that I had really gone through these stages of taqwa. So therefore, there is no sin on me, and you cannot consider yourself in any way that you have the right to flog me because it says I'm not at sin. I'm not held accountable because I've lived through all these stages. My faith is in place, and you can't do that. Well, let's see what happened. Umar ibn al-Khattab, he said, أَلَا تَرُدُّونَ عَلَيْهِ ما يقول. He told the other Sahaba, would you guys want to respond to him? So that's when, who? Ibn Abbas. I want you to look at this. Who's Ibn Abbas? When the Prophet ﷺ died, Ibn Abbas was only approximately 13 years old. The Prophet ﷺ makes the dua for Abdullah ibn Abbas, Allahumma faqihhu fi din wa allimhu ta'wil. Ya Allah, give him the deep knowledge in understanding the deen and teach him. In other words, give him the inspiration to learn how to derive and how to interpret the religion. Yes, salam. So Ibn Abbas, and you want to keep in mind, so what are we looking at? Abdullah ibn Abbas is how old right now? When the Prophet ﷺ died, he was approximately 13 years old. This is during Umar ibn al-Khattab's era, all right? And in that situation, we're looking at, so 11 plus 2, the 2 were basically the 2 years for Khilafat Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and then you had Khilafat Umar ibn al-Khattab. So we're looking at Abdullah ibn Abbas really being approximately 17, 18 years old right now. And Uthman ibn Mad'un, well, he was in the second year Hijrah in Badr. He was already fighting where? Well, he was already fighting in the Battle of Badr. In other words, he was a full-grown man because after all, Qudama ibn Mad'un was actually from the early Muslims in Mecca, and that was even in Al-Habasha, migrated to Al-Habasha. So right now, Qudama ibn Mad'un is going to be probably no less than near his 60s or probably mid 50s. And now we have Abdullah ibn Abbas, didn't even get to probably being 18 years old right now, responding. So what do we got? Umar ibn al-Khattab is right now the Khalifa and asking them to respond. Why couldn't he respond? He wanted the other ones to respond and not necessarily be the person to be holding as a person in chief, and basically the person to give the orders and the person to give the interpretation and the person to basically be in the judicial branch and legislation and the executive. So it was like, you know what? I'll let other people respond to this. In other words, I'll let the other experts in fiqh respond to this, and I'll basically not be this person that is going to be acting as the Khalifa to interpret the law and be the executive person to give you the order and basically order that your punishment be in the executive place, but I'll let you basically lay out your argument, and I'll let those other experts, and here the expert is Abdullah ibn Abbas. Abdullah ibn Abbas, he said, well, these ayat were revealed as عذرا لمن غبر وحجة على الناس، لأن الله تعالى يقول يا أيها الذين آمنوا إنما الخمر والميسر الآية. He said this ayah was revealed as an excuse to those that had basically died before this ayah. Which ayah? So he was basically explaining to him, said, listen, that ayah, the reason, let me erase all of this so we could see what we're talking about right there, and that way we won't confuse you, okay? I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you could see it, okay? So Abdullah ibn Abbas explained to him, he said, okay, now this ayah that you're referring to right here, that there's no sin if the person believed and the person basically had lived in faith, etc. He said this was actually in response to those that did not live long enough to see that the final revelation, that the Quran had made a complete statement that alcohol was haram. So therefore, he was explaining to him what he probably did not know. Now, that's in order to help us understand that the Sahaba were at different levels of knowing Islam and knowing the details of the Quran. All right. That's when he basically read the ayah and explained it to him. And he said, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ نَهَاهُ أَنْ يَشْرَبَ الْخَمْرِ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically revealed in the final thing that فَهَلْ أَنْتُمْ مُنْتَهُونَ, that are you going to end? This is going to be the final thing, and it was regarded as haram. So Umar ibn al-Khattab then confirms, and he said, you're right. So, ماذا ترون? What do you think we should do right now? How should we deal with one of our officials now is basically caught drinking? So Ali ibn Abi Talib said, well, if he were to drink, he was going to get drunk. If he gets drunk, then he would get into some form of, intoxication, confusion, etc. And if he gets into that, then he's going to start making up blasphemy and making lies. So, and he said, and we would know that a person that is making up lies is supposed to be flogged for 80 lashes. So now Ali ibn Abi Talib introduces, let's say, an analogy that, here we go, look at this. Then what we're going to assign is 80 lashes for a person that basically was drinking. Okay, I just want you to just kind of see how we got into all of this. And here, al-Hakim basically said, Sahihul Isnad, that the chain of narration for that is basically authentic. And walam yukharija. Who's walam yukharija? In other words, the Bukhari and Muslim did not of course get a narration that is equivalent to this one. Okay, let's see the other story. Now, the other story gives me a little bit more details in regards to what really happened. Let's see that al-Jarud comes from al-Bahrain. Now, we're taking different stories, and each one is giving me, I guess, a story from a different angle. Al-Jarud, remember, he's a Sahabi that was Christian, and he was actually one of the leading Sahaba. And, you know, it's quite interesting. Maybe, inshallah, we'll talk about Al-Jarud some other time, inshallah. But you know, just keep in mind, the Prophet ﷺ was extremely happy when Al-Jarud had become Muslim. And of course, his name was Bishr ibn Amr. That was Bishr ibn Amr, and he was basically al-Jarud, basically that Sahabi. Okay, now let's continue right there and see. So what happened? He basically comes from Bahrain, files a complaint. Oh, Amir al-Mu'mineen, the prince, the prince of the believers. But that was the name that they had used, or the prince for the believers. That was the name that they had basically used instead of using the word Khalifat al-Khalifa and then Khalifat al-Khalifat al-Khalifa, you know, all of that. So they would just say Amir al-Mu'mineen, just to make the story short, okay? And he said, Qudama ibn Mad'un had drunk something that is alcoholic. And I see and I would say that that's one of the principles, in other words, one of the borders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I have a responsibility to raise it to you. Is that snitching? That's not snitching. Because that's a responsibility when you see something wrong that you have to basically go to those in charge to make sure that something is done to correct such wrong behavior. That's not snitching. Okay, that's the younger generation's word that they would use. Okay, so what did he do? He basically needed to do something about it. That's Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar. So he basically goes and files the complaint. Umar ibn al-Khattab said, well, I'm not going to just accept your word like that. Who is a witness that such a thing is true? In other words, it's not probably a personal conflict between you and him, and maybe you were just trying to take over his position because you were the vice, and he was probably the person that was assigned as the deputy on my behalf. I just want to make sure, we need to make sure that there's someone else that's witnessing this. So he said, Abu Huraira basically said, Fada Umar Abu Huraira. Umar ibn Khattab called on to Abu Huraira. And he said, Umar ibn Khattab is right now investigating. Said, Abu Huraira, did you see him drinking? Abu Huraira, and this is a specific question, a direct question. Did you see him drinking? Don't tell me stories. It's a yes or no question. So Abu Huraira, well, I'm just right there, you know, that's not what the text is saying, but I'm just right there, you know, telling you the inference that this is what they understood. Okay. So فقال لم أره حين يشرب وقد رأيته سكران يقيء. He said, I didn't see him while he was drinking, but I did see him drunk and vomiting as a result. Did you see him drinking, taking the actual thing? No, but I saw that he was drunk, and I saw that he had vomited as a result of basically heavy drinking. So Umar ibn al-Khattab said, لَقَدْ تَنَطَّعْتَ فِي الشَّهَادَةِ. that's excessive in your witness. In other words, that's not how you would prove something. To say, yeah, well, my inference is that I saw him drunk and he was vomiting, so therefore he was drunk. It was like, no. Did you see him actually drinking? That's the question. And that's why Umar ibn Khattab said, "Tanatta'ta fi shahada." There's a specific question. In other words, let's say you saw a man and a woman together, all right? The inference, you would assume they're dating. No. Did you actually know that they were dating? Were you there to listen to the conversation? Let's say you saw somebody. When you're wanting to be a witness, it's not enough to make your own inference to the story. You got to make sure that we have primary sources. We make sure that before we accuse somebody of something, that it's not based on our own inference. It's not based on what we think and conclude out of what we're seeing, but we're actually seeing the actual thing. Let's say that's when Umar ibn al-Khattab is like, okay, well, we need a personal interview. What does Umar ibn al-Khattab do? It's not enough to judge somebody before talking them to directly and saying, okay, I'd like to talk to you about this. Can you tell me what happened? In other words, now what are we doing? Well, now we're interrogation. We're doing an interrogation. We're interrogating this person. Now we're right now doing this interrogation, investigating the matter. And of course, in order to judge somebody, I need to make sure that I talk to the person directly and say, what do you have to say about this? They have the right to defend themselves. Let's see what happened. Umar ibn al-Khattab basically orders, here we go, a written order, Qudama, and he was in al-Bahrain, you need to come to Medina. We need to interview you here. What's the case? Basically orders him to come. He goes all the way, comes all the way from al-Bahrain to al-Medina because, hey, this is where of course the capital is. This is where the high court is. That's where you're gonna come. When he comes in, of course, who was there? Qudama was there. Al-Jarud, who basically had come forward with the main complaint, was also there. So that's when, of course, Al-Jarud tells Umar al-Khattab, well, what you need to do is that Al-Jarud comes forward now, and he says, what you need to do is you need to apply the rule of the Lord Almighty on this person because he was drinking. So that's when Umar ibn al-Khattab recognizes that, sure, right now there could be a conflict of interest. Right now, you're basically right there coming forward, witnessing on your boss something, but I need to make sure that you are a witness and not necessarily a person that's conflicting and probably letting your conflict of interest get in the way. So Al-Jarud said, I'm right here. It's not an issue of conflict. It's an issue of that I'm coming forward with a witness. And I'm right there just basically coming forward with my witness. I want you to make sure here that you recognize that not every single time you would see something wrong and say, well, I want to come a witness. Let's say you see a woman, I don't know, doing something. You're going to go and call her husband and say, hey, I saw your woman doing this or this. Who said that this is Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar? You are not supposed to come in and think that you have the right to do that. This is right there a government, okay? Your duty is to basically hide it, but that's different if it was probably in school where, yes, there's a school administration. I would get to the school administration basically in order to put a certain law and order in place. But if you had seen, for example, a woman do something wrong, well, that's then when, just making sure that we don't confuse things. And then sisters going there, it's like, I'm doing somebody a favor and calling people. And yeah, I saw this happening and thinking that you're doing a favor and you're doing order, al-amr ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. There's a whole detail. So please don't get into that and get yourself in trouble. Okay, let's see. So right there, Al-Jarud said, I am just doing basically the witness. What happened? And he said, Inni anshuduka Allah. Umar ibn al-Khattab, of course, hears what Al-Jarud had to say. Umar then says, you are either going to hold your tongue. In other words, let's say that you had seen this and you had seen at least the inference of something. Did you see this actually happening? He said, this is a big claim. This is a big thing to accuse somebody of doing. If you don't hold your tongue, I will لأسوءنك. I'll punish you instead. So Al-Jarud then says, Wallahi ama wallahi ma dhalika bilhaq. Wallahi, this is not right what you would be doing. But your cousin, your cousin basically had been drinking and you want to punish me for this? Why did he say his cousin? Is he really his cousin? Well, now he wanted to come back to Umar ibn al-Khattab and say, well, if you wanted to call this a conflict of interest, well, I could use the same thing on you, basically. I could also say that because he is your cousin, that you're probably wanting to cover up for him. And I could come back with the same idea. And what are you going to do? You're right there wanting to punish me for coming forward and actually tell you that there is something haram that needs to be stopped right here? So that's when, of course, Umar ibn al-Khattab is listening to all of this. Abu Huraira was sitting down and he said, O Amir al-Mu'mineen, if you really were in doubt of our witness, well, why don't you ask Bint al-Walid, basically Bint al-Walid, which is the daughter of Ibn Mad'un. Ask his wife. If you're not accepting our witness, which is Abu Huraira, and which is Al-Jarud, you think we're probably not being fair to Qudama ibn Mad'un, and we're probably just using our own inference. Fair enough. You don't accept our inference and what we had seen? Ask his own wife. His own wife should know more. And of course, no one knows the husband more than the wife. So Umar ibn al-Khattab basically sent for Hind bint al-Walid, who's actually married to Qudama ibn Mad'un. And he said, by Allah, did you see your husband drinking? Hind then, which is his wife, would then present this witness that yes, he is drinking. Yes, he does drink. That's when Umar ibn al-Khattab tells Qudama, he said, Qudama, you are going to get flogged. And that's when Qudama says, if I had been drinking, well, you don't have the right to flog me, because this ayah basically says that I am part of the believers and part of this, and therefore I'm not going to be held accountable. We mentioned this claim and this claim in this regard. So basically, with the same context as the same narration, or sorry, the other narration is giving us the same story, at least within this argument. So that's when Umar ibn Khattab said, well, you had actually confused and made a confusion in this interpretation. If you had basically been practicing taqwa and you had avoided what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as impermissible, then of course Umar ibn al-Khattab had basically now this narration is pretty much saying the same thing. He's letting people know, I want you guys to respond to such a claim that Qudama ibn Mad'un is coming forward. And we said Abdullah ibn Abbas was the person to respond to it. And that's when Some had basically, of course, within this, they said, well, as you know, it seemed like he was going through some kind of an illness, some kind of a disability. So some wanted to, I guess, consider that, well, he's already ill. Who knows what kind of an illness he had, but they said, we don't think that it's right that you would flog him because he's already ill. In other words, for an ill person, if you're going to flog him, that's probably going to get him probably even more sick, and you never know, it might cause more infections and probably lead to something even worse. That's when Umar ibn al-Khattab was quiet, and for a couple days he didn't take action until one day he woke up and basically just made the final determination that no, it is going to be implementing the rule of law, and he's going to be flogged. So what happened? So in that situation, when he asked, what do you think we should do in terms of regards of Qudama? So they said, some of them said, don't flog him because he's already ill. But Umar ibn al-Khattab considered rule of law goes first. And he said, Inni wallahi la an yalqa Allahu tahta as-sawt ahabbu ilayya min an alqa Allah wa hiya fi unuqi. He said, by Allah, even if he were to die under this flogging, it would be better for me than me meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when I was going to be held accountable for not flogging and implementing the rule of law, i.e. Sharia. And he said, by Allah, I'm going to flog him. And he got the flog and then got him basically flogged. And well, basically the Mawla, basically somebody that I guess is assigned to do the job. That's when he basically got a sawt raqiq saghir. It wasn't something really big. It was more of a small thing, and that's what he was hitting with. Umar ibn al-Khattab basically took that, and in that situation, when that person basically got this small flog thing, that's when Umar ibn al-Khattab saw, oh, wait a minute, أخذتك دقرارة أهلك. This person, of course, who brought this flog that was a very thin flog. That's when Umar ibn Khattab said, you know what? The family, in other words, your genes of being soft is basically coming forward. But no. إيتوني بصوت غير هذا. Give me غير هذا. Give me a different tool, a different flog, basically the actual stick. Give me a different one, not something that is very thin and very small. That's when فجاءه أسلم. Aslam is basically another Sahabi. He brought him a sawt, a complete sawt. In other words, it's wide enough, it's big enough. And Umar ibn al-Khattab then ordered that Qudama would be flogged. Then Qudama, well, he was really angry at Umar ibn al-Khattab. He still was not content and was really angry. Qudama was not only angry, but he basically avoided Umar. They went together for Hajj, but he would not talk to Umar. Qudama and Qudama, then he basically just, of course, even though they went back from Hajj, but Qudama would never talk to Umar because he considered that, no, you had really transgressed the limit. That's what he considered. Okay. Now, Umar ibn al-Khattab was in this place, and Umar basically slept there. But then when Umar ibn al-Khattab woke up, it seemed like he had a dream. And then he said, get me Qudama. Go and get me Qudama, because I see something in my dream that I have to salim Qudama. I have to basically make peace with Qudama because he is my brother. Then Qudama refused to come. Umar ibn al-Khattab then ordered, you know what, bring him, drag him in any way. He needs to come. I really need to talk to him. I really need to ask I need to ask him to forgive me. And that's when they basically were friends again. Okay. Okay, that was the story of Qudama ibn Mad'un. And let's say there was no one from Ahl Badr, in other words, from those that participated in the Battle of Badr, that were flogged for al-Khamr other than Qudama ibn Mad'un. And that's the end of our story for today. There's always a lot to say. Maybe we could just finish this page, right? And then the other page. Okay, let's continue. قال ابن العربي. Who's Ibn al-Arabi? Ibn al-Arabi al-Maliki, a great scholar from the Maliki madhab. He actually has tafsir just for Ahkam al-Quran. It's about in almost, some of them are 3 volumes, some of the printouts are 3 volumes, and some are in 5. And he basically said, what this indicates in this ayah, and what Ibn Abbas, in the story, of course, and Umar ibn al-Khattab, all of that is basically to tell us that أنه لو كان من شرب الخمر واتقى الله في غيره لا يحد على الخمر ما حد على الخمر أحد. That, in other words, he was saying that if we're going to say that if a person is religious and that they're going to get away with this, then in that situation, anybody can claim being religious and then they can get away with it. He said that the story and the most important conclusion that we would get is not because a person is showing piety and showing a form of being religious, it doesn't mean that they would have the right to get away with the wrong behavior. So in other words, they're going to be held accountable. Okay. So Ali ibn Abi Talib, there was a narration that a group of people from Bilad al-Sham. So why Bilad al-Sham? Bilad al-Sham, even the Arab, they were obsessed with drinking, but Bilad al-Sham were even more obsessed with drinking because they basically had the grapes. Okay, they had lots of grapes, and therefore, of course, they had, I guess, the most and the best quality of what would make wine, which is grapes. And they basically said, well, it's halal. And they went on, of course, using the same ayah and basically claiming exactly what Qudama ibn Mad'un had claimed. And of course, that's when Ali ibn Abi Talib, Umar ibn al-Khattab, they both agreed that if they do not basically stop drinking, and if they do not repent, that they would basically be fought, and we would have to write them, in other words, even if it's a whole city, we would have to put it in correction. There's no playing games in this. Okay, so inshallah, tomorrow we'll be continuing this ayah right there, and it says فيه 8 مسائل. Okay, فيه 8 مسائل. Okay. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. MashaAllah, we've got a lot of new faces and a lot of new beautiful people today. I could see Khadija, we got Arwa, Emery, Sophia, Ira, and Thuwayba, and Mas'uda, Maryam, MashaAllah, Latifa, Khadija, MashaAllah, beautiful people join us today. And if there are any questions, you can unmute yourselves. And if you would like to write it in the chat, that's also possible as well. All right, that's okay. What we'll do, we'll stop the